Well, welcome everybody. My name is Andrew Hopper. I was born in 1844. I actually came to the area in 1860 with my parents, Andrew, my mother was Eliza, and my 4 siblings. We came from Pennsylvania and to homestead in the Hassan Valley area. So you might imagine 1861 is when the Civil War started. So as word got back to our area, that was really a topic of conversation. In 1862, that heightened a little bit more because President Lincoln issued a call on July 4th for 300,000 additional volunteers to serve in the Army. The summer of '62 was really nice in our area. The crops were really good, had a lot of potential. We didn't have any grasshoppers that year. Other years, they were really a problem. No cyclones or other problems. People were healthy. It was just a really good summer. And then, so with that as a backdrop, and then the president's call for additional volunteers, I left on August 16th with W.W. Pendergast and 7 other men from the area to go to Fort Snelling to enlist in the Army. We arrived several days later, and it was the next morning when we were surprised to hear from a Captain Whitcomb who had just arrived that the Indians were on the rampage out in the west, and that several families, Robinson Jones, Howard Baker, and their families were killed in Acton several days ago. And that they were really afraid that all the settlers in the West were going to be massacred. Governor Ramsey came down to Fort Snelling to talk to Captain Whitcomb just to get better information. Talked to W.W. Pendergast, who was with us. He was pretty well known at the time, and to get his assessment, but we really didn't know anything because this all took place actually the day after we had left. Several hours later, however, a courier arrived from the upper Minnesota River region with news that a Captain Marsh and half of his company had been attacked and killed by the Indians. So then we knew this was for real. We hadn't actually officially enlisted yet, so our group talked amongst ourselves and we decided that we wanted to come back to Hutchinson to defend our families, our homes, and the town. So that's what we did. Captain Whitcomb came with us. He actually was able to bring 75 muskets and 3,000 rounds of ammunition. He acquired 2 teams of horses and wagons to help bring the supplies back, and we made it back in a couple of days. When we did get to Hutchinson, we found that there were 50 refugees from the Upper Sioux Agency that were in town. They made it out with the help of a Sioux man named John Otherday. We put them up in some of the homes around town for the night, but then the next day they wanted to go farther east where they thought there'd be more safety. We as individuals and as a town had to decide then what we wanted to do. Were we going to leave or would we stay? So we got everybody together down by the motel and talked it over. There's a lot of differences of opinions, and it was decided then that a paper would be sent around and people could sign that if they wanted to stay. And at first people were reluctant to do that until 3 women stepped forward: Sarah Harrington, Ellen Harrington, and Doc Ellis's wife. And they really, should I say, encouraged the men, to sign up and to do that. And they were willing to stay and defend the city and do whatever they could do to help protect the city. So the decision finally was to stay. And not just to stay, but to organize, build a stockade, and then defend the city if and when the Indians actually came. So they organized first and formed the Home Guard. Lewis Harrington, who was one of the founders of the town, he was named captain. Oliver Pierce and I were lieutenants. And then after that, we started working on plans for the stockade. We did have a rule at the time that you couldn't leave town without a pass. and the only way you could get the pass was that you would assure us that you'd actually come back. So obviously it was important that people did stay and work out and help us with this. This is a map of the stockade, really the town at the time. The stockade was this area right here. It was built in the town square where I've heard now there's a library there. The walls were about 100 feet long, 8 feet tall. We had portholes about every 4 feet. And then around the perimeter was a 3-foot trench that was dug to help slow up the Indians if they did come. It took about 12 days to build the stockade. We had about 350 people, men, women, and children at the time in the stockade. So things went along pretty well. Towards the time that it was being completed, Captain Strout and 60 men came on their way to Acton. I volunteered to help serve as a guide for them, and we left. The first night we camped out, several men came into the camp and warned us that there were Indians in the area. So that proved beneficial because the next day as we were heading out, we were attacked. 3 of our men were killed, 23 were wounded, but we were able to fight through that and actually started coming back to Hutchinson where there is greater safety with that. I went ahead to help warn the settlers that were on the road as well as raise the alarm in Hutchinson. When I got to Hutchinson and Captain Harrington heard the news, he assembled 30 men and rode out to try to meet up and relieve Captain Strout. They met together about 3 miles out of town. The Indians had stopped pursuing them, so everybody was able to get into town safely. The injured soldiers were put up into the hotel, and the women helped to take care of them. It didn't last long, though, because later that night, the Indians tried to get into town. We had sentinels at the bridge, and they stopped them and raised the alarm. Everybody in the stockade was on high alert, as you can imagine, but then nothing else happened that night. The next day was September 4th, and it was a bright, beautiful day, just like today. No Indians were to be found, but people were leery, so they didn't want to leave the fort. But there were some Germans who were concerned about their wheat. Oh, what's that? They were concerned about the wheat because, working on the fort, that was the main concern for everybody. And the fields then were neglected. It was getting to be harvest time, and they didn't want to lose all their wheat. So they decided, there were 7 of them that decided to leave and to go to their fields. They were pretty determined, as Germans might be, and went out. They had a team of horses and a wagon, and they only made it about a half a mile before they were started to be shot at. Mr. Heller was wounded in the hip. They were able to turn around the horses in the wagon and get him into the wagon, and then they were able to get back into town safely after that. But it wasn't long after that when we could see Indians starting to come down through the hills and the forest and start encircling the town from the east, the north, and the west. At that time, William Ensign was sent by horse to Glencoe to try to bring reinforcements back, which he did, and he was able to get through all right. The Indians then went to start burning some of the buildings, the outlying buildings. The Pendergast Academy, which is on the north side of town on the hill, was burned. Indians were actually ringing the school bell while it was burning, and until it started to collapse. Other buildings then started to be burned as well. At that time, the soldiers were brought from the hotel back into the safety of the fort. Wasn't as comfortable, but definitely a lot safer. The Indians were surprised at, our reaction. Up until this point, when they attacked, the settlers would flee. And they were able then to loot the buildings, burn down buildings, and then, if they came across people, oftentimes, they were killed. We were resolved to stay. The Indians actually thought we would flee and left about a third of their number, their warriors, to the east, thinking that we would go that direction to seek greater safety. And then the others would kind of follow behind us and push us into this trap. So it was very fortunate that we did decide to stay. The battle itself continued most of the day. We actually had a plan where the home guards would go out and actually engage the Indians outside the fort. Lieutenant Pierce would take some men to the north. Pendergast would take some to the south. Captain Harrington would go to the west, and I'd go to the east. And we did that. We engaged some, trying to save as many buildings as we could, as well as our horses and cattle, because we were seeing them stolen or killed, right before our eyes. So whatever we could do, we were willing to try to do that. Captain Strout saw what was happening and ordered the men to come back into the stockade, because that was the primary concern. And most did. However, myself and some others stayed out in the field. The battle, like I said, went through the day, but then gradually wore down by late afternoon. It was about that time that William Enston returned with 40 men from Glencoe and more ammunition as reinforcements. So we thought there'd be more attacks that night. We posted double sentries just to make sure that we weren't surprised at all, but nothing actually did come. We found out later from some Indians that were taken prisoner in a subsequent battle that they had talked about coming back and attacking Hutchinson that night of the 4th. However, there were some older warriors, and they really talked against that, convinced the others not to, that it would be easier just to take the plunder that they had and then go other places where the element of surprise would be in their favor. They just thought that, our fortifications and preparations were too much to risk. We were fortunate. We didn't have any injuries inside the fort or the people that went out to do battle. No deaths or no injuries at all. We did hear from those Indian prisoners that 4 of the warriors were killed and 15 others were wounded. Outside the fort, though, farther out, we weren't so lucky. Caleb Sanborn had gone back to his farm that was east of Cedar Mills. His body was found later. Mr. Spouty was killed west of town, and his wife and 2 children escaped and tried to work back to the stockade until they were captured and killed on the south side of town. I've heard there's a factory over here now, so there's a stone marker marking that point where they were found. But all in all, it was, we were pretty successful. We were really the only town in the West that didn't stampede or flee, so we were proud of that. People stayed in the stockade for the winter, but others had to leave because, frankly, there weren't enough homes left standing for everybody to stay. We did have some soldiers that stayed with us actually through the summer of 1863, even though the war actually ended in December of 62. After that conflict, I continued to serve. I did join the Army. I fought in 16 Civil War battles, one of which I had a wound in my wrist, but made it through the war okay. Came back to Hutchinson, and in 1868 I married Adelia Fuller. Adelia was the niece of Lewis Harrington, and she was in the stockade during the conflict. She helped take care of the wounded soldiers as well as reloading muskets and guns as needed during the conflict itself. We had 4 boys, Frank, Jay, Lewis, and Will. I served in city government for 10 years, and then I was McLeod County Sheriff for 8 years after that. So I enjoyed the area. Really the hardship, though, and the exposure from the war took its toll on me. and I wound up dying July 19th, 1892 at 48 years of age. But really lived through some historic times, and really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share that with you all today. So thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy the day.